But something I did do, and funnily enough, I know that that Eyal here is an absolute hater when it comes to this.
I don't have any hate in my heart, dude.
Look at
Oh,
what I've
vocal
just pulled
rider.
out.
Holy shit.
In fact, yeah, I think I heard.
How did you know?
Because I think I heard you talking about it with Dan Corniff on the podcast, where everybody involved in the podcast just went on like a bit of a tirade about how lame plugins like this are, which I totally get. But what I like about it, especially when I'm dealing with vocals that are already really compressed like this, or if I'm compressing my vocals on individual tracks, if I'm working with raw vocals, then I'd be compressing them on individual tracks, so they'd all be kind of compressed separately. But you still get a build up in volume when multiple tracks come in. Like, so for example, here you've got like the group vocals, you've got the vocal doubles, and you have the lead vocals all going at the same time. So no doubt there's going to be a boost in vocal level that perhaps is not necessary at that point. You could go through and automate that stuff, and that's totally cool. But I find that this, what it's supposed to do and what it does do is it levels out the vocals, but with no compression artifacts. It's just like literally like a fader being moved around. And I really like what that does. It really saves me a lot of time when it comes to mixing in large stacks of vocals and getting them to sit very evenly.
Maybe I didn't do a very good job with it.
That
could be it.
Now you're supposed to feed the track to it through the sidechain, but I'm not really using it for that. Like, I'm not trying to get it to set the vocal level in the mix, which maybe is something which people don't approve of so much. I'm really just using it like a vocal flattening device, basically, like an overall vocal flattening device. So the key is to use the sensitivity control to set the level that you want and to make sure that the fader is round about 0 most of the time. So it's just kind of going backwards and forwards, because some nasty stuff can happen. Like, if you've got it set up badly, so it's kind of bringing the fader down a lot of the time, when it's working, it means that sometimes, like in a gap between vocals, the fader's going to go back to 0, and then when the next vocal comes in, it takes a second for it to bring that fader down. You get these weird kind of spikes in the vocal. So I'm just going to set the sensitivity on this and everything until I feel like the vocal is sitting well, and make sure that the fader's around 0.
Another day pulls me down to my knees and holds the gun to my fucking head. Can't feel a thing. Reposition.
So it's doing pretty subtle stuff, but do you notice there, just as those extra vocal doubles and harmonies came in, it just dipped it, but I guess probably about like a dB or something, no more, but just enough to keep it working well.
Can't feel a thing. Reposition, blowing my life about the muck. Oh God, I'm speaking in swirling walls, and now the walls are letting in silence, spiraling down to the floor.
Another thing that I like about it is it brings up the low-level detail at the end of a phrase. Like if you have a delay on there or something, because it's still picking up something on the track and it tries to make it louder, it actually kind of brings out your reverbs and delays nicely at the end of most phrases. It can kind of spare you a bit of extra automation, like bringing up a delay or reverb at the end of a phrase, which you might
Maybe I just had it set wrong when I used it.
Yeah.
But also maybe when I've critiqued mixes where people use it, it could just be that they haven't known what they're doing, and so
Totally.
I've associated with guys that are looking for an easy way out and just don't know what they're doing yet. But it's kind of one of those things, like I talk shit about pitching guitars down and stuff, but when Meshuggah did it, it sounded great because they can do anything and it'll sound great. So it's one of those things where I feel like with most audio tools, especially stuff on the podcast that I'll rail against, it's not so much that I'm railing against the tool itself, because I'm pretty agnostic towards tools. It's more that the way that I feel like people who are still learning use it. Like, for instance, like MS processing. It's like I know just how powerful it is and how great it can be when used properly, but I rail against it because a lot of guys who are first learning how to mix or master, they turn to it because they read about how powerful it is, and I think they should stay away from it because it's too powerful, and it's one of those little goes a long way kind of things, and you really should understand EQ inside and out before messing with that.
Totally. So the way that I like to use Vocal Rider when I'm actually doing stuff, I'm not going to bother to do this through the whole song because it involves literally playing through the whole song, is you can actually write the automation from this fader to the track, so that this, instead of reacting in real time, just starts reading the fader values. So if I set up this automation lane to be like in touch mode, and I set this to write, when I hit play, it's essentially just going to write all of the fader moves to this track so that we can actually see what it's doing, and then we can edit it as we see fit, because that's something that sometimes needs to be done. So I'll just do it for like this section as far as over here, basically, like this section here. Because we've got everything from like an isolated track to like 3 different tracks going on simultaneously there, and I want to make sure that you can see how it handles all of that. So let's see what happens.
Kind of scary when you see what it's doing.
Cool. So you can see what it's written there. You can see probably there's some weird stuff that it does. Like, for instance, at the beginning, it's got these weird ramps and whatnot. So I'm just going to get rid of those entirely. The other thing to be aware of when you're using it is, for example, it's going to try and bring out the breaths in front of your phrases because it reads some information there. So it's quite typical for me to simply just delete like the information right at the beginning of a phrase because I don't necessarily want to bring out the breath. In fact, I generally want to kind of bring those things down. But you can see the extent of the automation that it's writing is like way more than you would ever bother to do by hand. And occasionally you're going to disagree with what it does, so it's important to listen to it and really tell. But the cool thing is I find that once you level relatively the vocals the way that you want, if you use that, it's just a way of keeping the vocals pinned in volume in the mix as an overall unit, but keeping the relative balance that you like throughout.
I see. So you're not actually using it live. You're writing the automation, then
editing it.
Oh, okay. So it's basically just a major time saver automation-wise.
Right. And the reason why I choose to write it that way is because so now this is just going to read, like I set this to read mode. So now this fader is just tracing whatever's happening there, but it's no longer reacting to the source materials. Like, so, for example, I noticed in the chorus, the vocals kind of got a bit too quiet for my liking. Actually, it was pulling them down too much and the lead vocal got buried. At this point, I can automate up the vocal, like the lead vocal line, and it's not going to affect the vocal rider because at that point, the vocal rider is simply reading this information here. It's not judging anything new. So I can now go and play with the relative balances as much as I like, and I'm not going to be fighting against this fader that's trying to counteract everything I've done. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of typically how I would use it. So there I brought up that lead vocal by 1.5 dB for the chorus so that we can hear it more clearly, but it's going to maintain all the fader moves which are more to do with how all of these lines are reacting to each other. So we can hear what that sounds like. So I actually put the automation in at the wrong point there. Should have been over here. So I promise you, if you hadn't watched it write in all that automation, you'd probably hear it as way more transparent than it is. You might now be kind of very aware of all the little changes that have been made. And it's certainly kind of tricky to let go and let the machine make those decisions. As I say, it's really important to go back and listen and
You
check
definitely
everything.
opened my mind, though.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You like it? It's pretty
sure.
cool, you know. Something that was maybe not so great was the amount of volume disparity between these doubles. Like, they're soft on the first half of the phrase and then heavy on the next. I guess Spencer really wanted that. That's probably something I wouldn't have done. And what's happening is the vocal rider is reacting to that. It's kind of pulling down the whole vocals on the second half of every phrase during the chorus, which is meaning that you're kind of losing the lead vocal a tiny bit on there. So it probably requires some additional automation, and that's the kind of stuff which can spend a while, and you can spend a while doing, and we certainly did with Periphery 3. So as I mentioned in the notes that you guys had when you started working on it, just because these things have been presented this way, that's not to say that they don't require additional work to get them leveled, cutting through the mix as you see fit. And certainly I do think that using that volume automation on the vocal rider is a cool way of bringing out all the detail where it's needed and keeping the vocals as a unit level in the mix. Way better than using, for example, a limiter or something like that, which is going to adversely affect stuff as it starts to pile up. So yeah, that's kind of how I treated the vocals with this.